he's very happy to host us at the Hampton Mosque. It will be 2 weeks from tonight. So next week is the last week of this series. And then the week after that, at 6 p.m., whoever wants can come to the Hampton Mosque, and we'll watch Muslims do Salat, and Islam will be there to talk a little bit more about Salat and about Islam. We'll be able to ask questions. We'll be able to see a mosque and the way Muslims use it. So I think that was in the St. Andrew's Bulletin, and there's information on St. Andrew's website, I think.
Yes.
So that's 2 weeks from today, and we'll meet at 6 p.m. at the mosque in Hampton. And there is a link to the mosque website and directions and that sort of thing. So everyone's invited. I talked. There's no dress restrictions or anything like that. The only thing I'll warn you is that when we enter the building, we have to be ready to take our shoes off. They go around the prayer room without shoes. But besides that, no restrictions. Everybody's welcome, and so I'm hoping as many people as possible can come out to that. It's really good to not just talk, but to see a place of worship. I think David was showing Islam and Haroon our sanctuary. Sounded like they had a good time.
They probably have a really twisted idea right now, but I'll try.
All right. So, if we're going to get a twisted idea, at least get it from a Muslim. All right. So tonight, what I want to talk about is some some issues that are particularly difficult for the 21st century for today. And where I'm going with this is that there's some of these things are in the newspaper a lot, and they're very much a part of our world, especially the Middle East and these terrorists. And I don't think that we often have a good perception, a good understanding of the way most Muslims are sort of looking at the Middle East and even some of the things having to do with terrorists, with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and the rest. So I want to try to look as much as we can. I'm probably not going to solve the Middle East problem tonight, but at least I'm hoping to that we can get a kind of understanding of the way Muslims look at some of these things, and hopefully that helps us to move forward, particularly as Christians. So starting off, there are two concepts that I want to talk about to start. And first is that I'm not sure that Christians always think about this, but Muslims are more likely to think about a distinction between Muslim land and Christian land. They actually look at the map a little bit more. And the second thing is that even if we don't think about this a lot, in the Islam world, all through the Muslim world, especially with Muslim scholars and thinkers, everyone in the Muslim world understands this reality that Christian nations are richer and more powerful than Muslim nations. Everyone knows that. So I'm going to probe these two ideas just a little bit. So first of all, this is a map titled Islamic Conquest at Their Height. Now, Muhammad dies, we were talking about Muhammad a few weeks ago. Muhammad, the date that we have for his death is usually 632 AD. And this dark green area is more or less the area that was Muslim around the time of his death. Now, by 750, the Muslims had actually conquered everything in this color and this color. the gray and the yellow. The historians, the military historians, can't really come up with a good explanation of this. How is it that disorganized Arab tribes managed to conquest this huge, huge territory? It actually completely destroyed the Sassanid Empire's long-existing Persian Empire. A lot of this territory was actually taken from the Byzantine Empire. And it's very hard for the military historians, to explain how tribes of Arabs that had before been disorganized and not terribly advanced managed to get together to conquer all of this land. Now, what would a Muslim say? What would a religious Muslim say? How would the religious Muslim explain the ability to conquer this land?
God.
Right. Right. So that's their traditional understanding, that God did miracles and enabled them to take all of this land. So God gave them this land by doing these miracles in the early years of the Muslim Empire. And that means that Muslims like to think of this as land that was given to them by God. Now, Muslims, I think, don't really worry a whole lot about Spain today. That sort of seems to be Europe, and maybe some of the outlying areas. But everything in this light green color and the dark green color was given to them by God, and that's kind of sort of a basic understanding, especially if you're a faithful Muslim. And everyone also understands that most of the pink area, at least Europe and the North, is Christian. Right? So Europe was historically Christian. Even Russia, most of the last 1,300 years, Russia is a kind of Christian country, right? So there's a border between the Islam land and the Christian land. So early Muslim conquests they seem to be miraculous, and early in Muslim history, borders between Muslim territory and Christian territory are more or less defined. Okay, now there's one particular exception, and this is the Crusades, where Christians, by force, they invaded Muslim territory, right? And we captured the Holy Land, we captured the land around Israel and the land around it. And Christians controlled at least part of that land for about 200 years until the Muslims were able to take it back. So the lesson here is that even though God allowed the Christians to come in, with force and take land, we as Muslims persevered, and at some point God allowed us to kind of get together and take the land back. So that's kind of history. It's something that Muslims might think about. All right. So I'll come back to this in a second. The other concept is this recognition that Christian nations are richer and more powerful than Muslim nations. So the question: if Islam is the right religion, if by practicing Islam we're doing what God wants us to do, if God really wants us to listen to Muhammad and read the Quran instead of the Bible and follow the pillars, if that's the right way to go, why is it that the Christian world is richer and more powerful and has better technology than the Muslim world? Why is it that the Christians were able to overpower the Ottoman Empire and capture India and kind of dominate all of Muslim territory? So this actually has been maybe the dominant question in the Islamic world for about 200 years. All kinds of Muslim thinkers have tried to come up with answers and responses to this. And they still talk about this today, because if you want to be a Muslim, you have to recognize that this is reality, and it's going to impact the way you practice Islam. It suggests that maybe we did something wrong, right? Maybe there's something wrong about Islam or the way Muslims have practiced Islam if we ended up in a place where Christians are richer and more powerful, right? That's kind of the way things look. And so then we have to start thinking and talking about what do we have to do differently so that we're not going to be behind Christians. Now, in the West, usually Muslims who move to Britain and move to the United States usually say that Muslims need to accommodate more. And one of the ideas is that they usually start to accept this idea that the state, the government, really should not be involved in religion, what we call the separation of church and state. So that the way the state functions is one area, and then what we do in the mosque is something else. And we're better off not mixing the two. Another idea is that Muslims really should be willing to work and study with non-Muslims. Now, in Christian history, some of you may know that in most of Europe allowed Jewish people to live in Europe, but they had to live in particular communities because we didn't want Jewish people or people that weren't Christian kind of polluting Christians. They didn't want Christians to get bad ideas and to sort of wander off on the wrong way. Sometimes even in church in the 21st century, a lot of us sort of think about to what extent we want our kids to hang around with kids that aren't Christian, or kids that don't behave the way we want them to behave. To what extent should we as Christians have non-Christian friends and do things with people who aren't Christians? So, in the same way, Muslims who live in the West more or less accept the idea that even though there's maybe a danger that if we hang out with Christians, we'll start to not do the right thing. Maybe the fact that we've separated ourselves from Christians for so long, maybe that's why we ended up kind of behind the Christians. And so maybe we should be willing to work in a place that's owned by Christians, that's run by Christians. Yes?
I don't mean to interrupt exactly, but I get the impression from what history I know, which isn't, that much, of course, that throughout history, let's put it that way, when people are allowed to think for themselves, that's when the strength of the hierarchy within the religion begins to fade because the adherents are falling away. So that the Catholic Church couldn't put down Luther. I mean, there was just no way. His religion caught on, and the Catholic Church eventually lost its place as the ruling religion of Europe, right? And the same thing, you could almost say, happened within Judaism when there was only one form of the Jewish religion, and then the Jews were let out of the ghettos. And guess what? They started thinking for themselves, and they wanted to do things differently, and they did. So the answer really, it seems to me, is that if a religious faction is unable to make its adherents stick to their routine and not become, quote, free thinkers, then it's going to become diluted. And the secular world, which is totally ruled by money, is going to take over. And it seems like that's what you see in the world.
Okay, yeah, I think so. I think this applies very well to the Muslim world. If Muslims start to interact with Christians and with the world in general, there is a real danger that they're going to be less Muslim. And there's also the potential benefit that they'll do better. They'll be smarter and hopefully better people and richer, and maybe that helps civilization to advance. So yes, it's an issue in Judaism because this is kind of what the Haredim kind of talk about, or even the
that's in Israel.
Okay,
they don't exist anywhere else that I know of. Do they exist anywhere else?
Well, in New York as well.
Oh, right, up there in Muncie. Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
So Judaism certainly, and we as Christians, most of us here as Christians, this is something that we talk about. We kind of approach this in different ways. How much do we have to insist that we should be Christians? Because if you're a good Christian and you try your best to hang out only with Christians and to do everything in what we call a Christian way, then you're not going to lose your faith. Once we start to mix with other people and start to talk about Islam on a Thursday night in church, then that might be a little bit dangerous. And I think there are people in our community that sort of worry that something like that will happen to us. So it's tricky. You used the word hierarchy. It's not just hierarchy, but I think the community in general. So in the West, Muslims tend to be more willing to work and study, to take that risk that they might end up less Muslim. And also they kind of redefine Islam. If you talk to me later, since we're celebrating 500 years of Luther, there's a Muslim scholar named Tariq Ramadan who has been called the Muslim Luther. He writes a lot about these ideas, about how to think about Islam for Muslims in the West, sort of recognizing that Islam needs to be practiced a little bit differently in the United States than it has been practiced in a country that is entirely Muslim. How do you live as a minority group? How do you live as Muslims in a country that's basically Christian, like the United States? It's going to look different than how you would live as a Muslim in Saudi Arabia. So anyway, the idea of accommodating. So accommodating, that means that yes, you're willing to kind of look at Islam and trying to figure out what things maybe you can change and still be honoring to God, still obeying God. And that's a lot of what we do in the church, even in the 21st century. And the Episcopalians here know that we've struggled with a number of issues over the last, even 30 or 40 years. Even, is it okay to have women? Is it okay to ordain women? It wasn't when I was a kid, but now it is. What do we do with gays and lesbians? Is it okay for them to be members and receive communion and possibly be ordained? Some other issues that have been hard to deal with, but it goes back to accommodation. When and how can we change things that have been historically Christian or historically Episcopalian? I understand there was controversy when the prayer book was changed, right? Rite 1 and Rite 2. All of that, I think that hasn't entirely been settled at St. Andrews. So when I use the word accommodate, that's what I'm thinking. We constantly do this in the church. I personally think it's good to be thinking through these issues, but they can be scary. And many of us are always going to worry that accommodating too much is kind of getting us away from what we're supposed to do. So Muslims in the West tend to accept at least the principle of accommodation, at least the principle of sort of rethinking Islam in order to make it feasible to sort of gain the benefits of living in community, living in community in a Christian setting, in a Christian country. Now, another answer, of course, is the other side of the coin. So some Muslims say that Muslims have been too accommodating. The reason that the Christians have been stronger, richer, and more powerful is that God really got tired of us Muslims changing too much and kind of getting away from the way we're supposed to practice Islam. So these Muslims must become more Muslim. Maybe the most important example is what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia follows a kind of very strict kind of Islam that really applies basically to Saudi Arabia and very few small countries around there. That's very strict. So this idea that women have to wear robes all the time and they can't drive and there's other restrictions, it actually applies really Saudi Arabia is the only country. Saudi Arabia, I guess, Afghanistan have sort of adopted that kind of thinking. That the problem, the reason that the Muslim world has been dominated by the Christians is that we as Muslims have kind of gotten away from what we're supposed to do. And so Muslims have been too accommodating. Muslims should be more Muslim, whatever that means. And this is important. Muslims' land should restrict the movements of non-Muslims. That we really shouldn't have Christians kind of running around this poor Islamic territory. All right. Now, the terrorists who use Islam, actually most of these groups really have these core principles in common. And these are three things that really, whether we're talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Islamic Jihad or Boko Haram or really about any of the groups that I'm aware of, they all are working for these three goals. First of all, Westerners do not belong in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the holiest Muslim territory because that has the two holy cities, Mecca, right? So that's where Muhammad was born and raised, where Muhammad first met God, and has the Kaaba, the place we go for the Hajj. And Medina is the city that Muhammad moved to with the community and set up the first Islamic community. So Westerners do not belong, Christians do not belong in the sacred, holy Muslim territory. Second, Jews and Christians should be expelled from Israel or Palestine. So if we go back to the map that I showed you, okay, so Israel-Palestine is right over here. So it's part of the this kind of Islamic core. And the idea of a Jewish or Christian, a non-Muslim state there, that's inappropriate. And Israel has to, Jews and Christians have to go. The main reason is that Muhammad ascended to heaven from Jerusalem. We talked about the Mirage in the first week. This is an event while Muhammad was living in Mecca, a miraculous event where in one night he goes from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem he ascends to heaven, and he meets everybody. He meets all the Old Testament prophets. He meets Jesus. Everyone agrees that he's the greatest prophet. Then it goes back to Jerusalem. So one of the two mosques on the Temple Mount is the place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. So Jews and Christians have to be expelled from Israel and Palestine, and then strict enforcement of Muslim law. So the different groups kind of disagree as to what those things are. Yes.
Does that ignore the 6,000 years of Jewish history?
Yes.
In that area?
Right. So God, yes, God gave Israel to the Jews. I don't know, where 2000 BC, something like that. But God can change his mind. Absolutely, right? I mean, because well, obviously, in our biblical history, he did basically, right? Israel was conquered in 586 BC, right? And
But they came back.
Muslims, what?
They came back.
They came back, but they did not establish their own country. They came back and they were a province of the Persian Empire and a province of the Greeks and the Romans, right? And so the Muslims didn't take Israel from the Jews, right? They took it from the Christians. And in that period, there were actually periods where where the Byzantine Empire forbade Jews from even going to Jerusalem. In Israel. So the Muslims say, yes, of course God gave it to Israel, and then God gave it to the Christians, and then he gave it to the Muslims. So it accepts that history, but God can, right? God can change his mind. All right, or God can kind of move on. So these things really every again, all the terrorist groups, they're not. I read things and some people seem to have this idea that the terrorists want to attack and conquer Europe or the United States, and none of them say things like that. The reason that they do terrorist attacks here is to kind of get us to agree to sort of leave them alone. What they want is they want Americans out of Saudi Arabia. They want Israel to disappear. And so the attacks are to get attention and sort of try to get their message that we're going to keep hassling you until you do what we want. I'll take a question, sure.
Yeah. So what about what I'm wondering if it's possible also the factor of that we're the rich people and they're the poor people, and is that some kind of the terrorist activity to equalize that or to destroy that?
Well, that's okay. So that would come under this idea of Muslim law. So I talked. I think the second week I talked about zakat, and I talked about the idea in the first week that everyone should be equal. So Islam is almost all Muslims agree on the principle and the concept that all people are Israel, and all people are equal. All people are completely equal. And I talked about how the pillars of practice kind of stress this idea. So for example, zakat, where you pay every year, you make a payment percentage of your wealth, a kind of property tax. How that tends to kind of equalize things better than the Christian or the Jewish idea of tithing, where you're only paying 10% of your earnings. So yes, we're rich, we're poor, you're rich. That's wrong. It shouldn't be like that. Absolutely. That's part of this idea of Muslim law. So it's kind of a basic Muslim principle that there shouldn't be some people that have a lot and some people, lots and lots of people that have very little. So this is one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia continually has tremendous problems with these groups, even though Saudi Arabia is certainly the strictest kind of Islamic country just about on the planet. They have huge problems because it's obvious to everyone that in Saudi Arabia there's a few people that are incredibly rich and a lot of people that have very little. Right. And of course, Saudi Arabia continually allows lots and lots of Americans wandering around Saudi Arabia. Why is that? Okay, the same thing, the whole money thing, the income inequality. Yes.
I have a little problem with strict enforcement of Muslim law, because my understanding of the Muslim religion as a whole is that it's like Christianity or Judaism. I'll go to Judaism because that's easier to express. You as being Reformed ones, and then a strict Orthodox group. So Muslim law to me, I can't think that there is one Muslim law.
Okay, well, if believe me, there are some Muslims that are sure that they know the right law.
Well, right.
And everyone else doesn't. So when I say strict enforcement of Muslim law, I'm saying Al-Qaeda has their view of what right Muslim law is, and everyone should do this. And if you don't do it, then you're liable to
And
punishment.
Wasabi does
Right.
too, but that's
Well, that's what I mean
relates
when I say
only to
this.
those particular terrorist groups.
Right. Yeah, that's why I put this in quotes. So each group has its own idea of what
You're not
Muslim law
saying
is.
that Muslims as a whole.
It says terrorists.
No, we're on.
Right. These are talking about terrorists who use Islam. I think this is true for just about every terrorist group. Every terrorist group has their own individual concept of what Muslim law is, and they just tend to be very strict about it. Okay, strict very often means that they kill you if you don't agree with them. So that's pretty strict. Okay. Okay, now I want to talk, so this is really, again, this is really what kind of holds what kind of unites these groups. It's really what they have in common. I really don't know of any group that is trying or interested in trying to, conquer the United States or establish some sort of Muslim law in the United States. They all seem to have this idea of the map. The map thing. They want Muslims that live in Muslim territory to follow their interpretation of Islam. So they do these terrorist attacks here and in Europe and so on, even in Saudi Arabia. But the idea is to kind of get us to sort of give up, spending our time in Saudi Arabia. The idea is to get us to give up kind of sending billions of dollars to Israel every year to defend them. They just want us gone. And that's really what they tend to be trying to accomplish. This is really what all of the groups want. This is what they say they want. They want Westerners out of Saudi Arabia. They want Israel to disappear, and they each have a kind of idea of what Muslim law is, and they want to enforce that. Yes, sir.
Aren't we kind of responsible for some of these problems through our own ignorance? I'm just thinking about 1991. We have female soldiers in Saudi Arabia running around in T-shirts driving trucks, which is so foreign to their culture. Was that what ignited this kind of terrorist fact?
I wouldn't say it ignited it, but I think I would
exacerbated it.
I think we have to be very careful. That's all. I mean, there are. The Army is very aware of kind of cultural issues. How American troops should behave in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. I personally, I'm not an expert in this. I wouldn't say that it caused it, but we have to sort of think through, what we do. And again, I'm fairly sure, I'm positive the armed forces, whenever they send anyone to Iraq or Afghanistan, they train the troops, I think, pretty well as to sort of what they should do. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that our females going over there and doing, just doing their job, maybe the literature that I've read says that some of the females in Saudi Arabia began to see there was another way and began to embrace wanting a little different life.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that is the Army. Being an engineer going, for ExxonMobil to help them get oil out of the ground. I'm not sure that's restricted to the Army, so the terrorists would certainly say that you bring Western women here, then they're gonna convince good Muslim women to kind of do what they're not supposed to do. So,
You can go back
Yeah.
through history, and there's a lot of things that would trip laws. Post-World War I, artificial boundaries for today's Middle East countries were set, and not in accordance with the local tribes that were there. There's a whole history of it.
yes, I hope we're doing better in the 21st century. Yes, things, Europe didn't always do a great job over there. And I think in the United States, my understanding is that the diplomatic corps of the United States is a better grasp of this. It's the sort of thing that they talk about in the UN when they're dealing with problems. So sure. Yes, and it's helpful if we as Christians sort of, I think sometimes we can be a little bit more empathetic or a little bit more understanding of how other people feel. And that can help us to kind of get past some of these difficult problems. I want to talk a little bit about Israel now. Just Israel in specifically, and that has to kind of it ties into what we've been talking about. So Muslims will call this Palestine. This is really more or less the name that's been known. Really, the Romans actually gave Israel this name. So it's a traditional area for what we call Israel, and the historical residents are Muslim Arabs. People have lived there for many hundreds of years. There's a few Christians, but most people in Palestine were historically have been Muslim. Okay, controlled from the Ottoman Empire for about 400 years. And so the Ottoman Empire kind of fell apart during World War I. They were allied with Germany. They weren't in really good shape, and they sort of collapsed. And now I need to introduce this term, and it's Zionism. And Zionism is a really political and cultural idea. We're talking about modern Zionism. It really doesn't have much of anything to do with religion, except possibly cultural. It's political and cultural. The idea is that the world should have a country for Jewish people. And the reason is that anti-Semitism is real and enduring. There really is anti-Semitism all through the world, and it doesn't go away. The Jewish people really can't count on anyone to help them. And less important is the cultural idea that a Jewish country could be the center of Jewish language, arts, and culture. As far as Palestine goes, Jews first started moving to Palestine in numbers in the early 20th century, mostly because of Russian anti-Semitism. So we know that there was a lot of immigration from Russia and Poland in the United States in the early 20th century. But it was for the same reason. A lot of anti-Semitism, and Jews started moving out. They had trouble moving into the European countries. European countries largely didn't want them. And so the United States took in millions of these people, including my mom's parents. So my mom was raised Orthodox Jewish because her parents were immigrants from Poland. Western Europe actually didn't mind Jews moving to Palestine, even though they started to see that the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. Because in Western Europe, people, even politicians, commonly perceived that there weren't many people in Palestine in the first place. So they didn't really see a problem with Jewish people moving there. So most of the early Jewish residents of what we call Israel were these Russian immigrants. Now, during World War I, Britain seized Palestine, and they were aided by the Palestinian Arabs who wanted their own country. At that point in history, lots of people around the world were talking about this concept of self-determination, right? That if you have your own group of people, you should sort of figure out what you want to do. All of the European empires were collapsing or had collapsed. Lawrence of Arabia, right? That movie, that's kind of about this. A British officer kind of helps Arabs to fight basically the Germans and the Ottomans in Palestine. So during World War I, Britain promises to give Palestine to the Jews, but they also promise Palestine to the Arabs. People who study British history say that this was not terrifically unusual for Britain to sort of do this kind of thing in this era. And what I've read is that apparently many of the British who knew that they were making these dual promises sort of just thought that the Jews and the Arabs would just work it out and they'd get along. There really wouldn't be much problem with the fact that we're making promises to two different people. Yes, maybe it didn't work out very well. In 1948, the UN finally grants independence to the Jewish state of Israel, and Israel right away is attacked by troops from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. But they managed to keep their borders, and so this is the border of Israel today, and it's pretty much looks like it was in 1948, except that in 1967, so the purple is what Israel looked like in more or less in 1948. In 67, Israel captured these spots in yellow in the 1967 war. So they were attacked, and they managed to, even though they were attacked, they managed to capture these periods. And so this spot is what's known as the West Bank, we read as the West Bank, and Gaza, and the Golan Heights. So the West Bank and Gaza have some autonomy, but they're still controlled by Israel. They're kind of occupied territory. So people there don't have the right to vote, and they're kind of again, they're subject to kind of Israeli supervision. And Israel has been negotiating with Syria to return the Golan Heights, and they've been doing this forever. The Golan Heights, there's a security risk. The Golan Heights are high, right? And people are going to be, nasty with you, and they're high and you're low. That's security problems. So Syria is not in the most stable shape today either. So that's constant negotiation. Okay, so now the way Muslims look at this is really what I'm leading to. So Europe and the United States took Palestine by force and gave it to the Jewish people. Right? 1917, Britain comes, and they come to Muslim territory, and they take it, and then they give it to Jewish people. So Palestinian Muslims who became refugees during those two wars are not allowed to go back to where they were from. This other thing is that Israel has actually committed quite a few human rights violations. And this surprised me when I first read this some years ago, but I've been following it carefully. Every year, just about every year, more Palestinian non-combatant civilians, so more innocent Palestinians are killed by Jews, or by Israelis, than Israelis are killed by Palestinians. More innocent Palestinians are killed by Israeli every year than innocent Israelis are killed by Palestinians. And there are groups that keep pretty careful track of this thing. And Israel's aware of this. And this is one reason that Israel tries, I guess they try to take steps to make sure that they're not doing this. But so there's real human rights abuses, and it doesn't get reported very well in the United States. But Muslims are more likely to think about these particular issues. So first, it's this fundamental. First, this first thing is this fundamental unfairness. The idea that that Jewish people should have a place where they can go. I personally think, as a Christian, I think that's a very good idea, a very right idea. One of the horrible things about the Holocaust during World War II, it's not only that the Germans tried to destroy all the Jewish people, it's that Jewish people had nowhere to go, that the countries of the world did not allow the Jewish people in. Anyone visited the Holocaust Museum in Richmond? Okay, I hope all of you get there. There's one exhibit about a ship called the St. Louis, which came to the United States, I think in 1941, maybe. Jewish people fleeing from the Germans, coming to the United States. The United States wouldn't let them enter. They wouldn't allow them. And they had to turn back, and eventually most of them had to go back to Europe and try to hopefully find some other way to escape. So for Jewish people, nowadays most Jewish people are Zionists in some form, because for Jewish people, even though 21st century, I guess things are okay, we never know, Jewish people never know when the country is going to shift, whether there's going to be some political event, and suddenly it's not going to be okay. So the idea of a country for Jewish people to go, if they can't go anywhere else, for me that makes sense. But the way Muslims might look at it is they would say, okay, if you Christians want a country for Jewish people, you don't have the right to come to a Muslim country and take land and give it to them. If Christians want a place of safety for Jewish people, Christians should give them some Christian land, some part of the United States that no one's using, or some part of some other country. But it's wrong, it's fundamentally wrong to decide that Jewish people need their own country and then come and take it away from Muslims in order to give it to Jews.
They can have Texas.
What?
They can have Texas.
Yeah.
The taxi drivers we had in Israel that started on this whole business, and he said, we have the deed from God to have this country. And I mean, I just didn't even bother to try to discuss it with him, but he quoted, the Bible.
A Jewish driver.
A Jewish driver, oh yeah,
Yeah.
a Jewish driver. So that he felt that from the beginning of time, sort of, Jews had been promised that land.
Right. So many Jewish people feel like this. The reason I was talking about Zionism as a political idea is that really was not the idea of the UN and Britain and even the Jewish people that were proposing this at the end of the 19th century. It was never, when it was proposed, it was this idea that God had granted land. It was never more than a very peripheral part of the discussion. The discussion was always a modern political expediency. That Jewish people are always going to be harassed, that Britain is always going to have Jewish people knocking on their door, asking for help, asking for entry, and that Britain doesn't want to always be dealing with this, France doesn't want to always be dealing with this, the United States doesn't want to always have to be pressured to accept refugees, then we should have a country for Jewish people. So it was always a political idea when Israel was being formed. Now, of course, yes, lots of Jewish people feel in their heart, they read in the Bible that God gave them this land. But what I'm hoping, what I think is helpful is that if we as Christians in the 21st century can sort of see this more as political rather than religious. There's a particular reason where this might help. Muslim concerns, most Muslims, I think, would talk about these things. So, the Palestinians who are dominated by Israel, a lot of them are having trouble. There's a lot of difficulties. The peace process, whatever the peace process is going, they want it to be even-handed and fair. And to many Muslims, sometimes it looks like the United States is kind of leaning more heavily on Israel's side than they should. They want the United States to be fair and equal. They also obviously want access to these holy sites, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They want to be able to go there. And they want, this is the last one, they want recognition of Jerusalem's significance for Muslims. So one of the difficult issues, over the last 40 years or longer, is whether Jerusalem should be part of Israel or whether it should be part of Palestine or maybe shouldn't be part of anyone. So presidents, when Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama were running for president, they all promised to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And then after they got elected, they all decided that that wasn't a good idea because they didn't want to tell everyone that Jerusalem was part of Israel. They wanted to allow this idea that maybe Jerusalem has significance not just for Jews, but for Muslims as well. So they all promised that they do it, and then they broke their promise. And candidate Trump, of course, also promised that he would do it. He was going to do it, I don't know, the first 100 days or something. And so far, he hasn't moved it. And I don't know whether he's going to or not. Now, the Israelis would like that because of what your taxi driver was saying. Jerusalem is part of Israel. But Muslims believe that Jerusalem was given to them by God. So this is maybe where it might be helpful for us to allow Jerusalem not to be part of Israel, despite what the Bible says. And am I allowed to say that? The Baptists, I might not be able to. But even though in the Bible, as some people have pointed out, even though the Bible promises Jerusalem to Israel, even though obviously Jerusalem has many very, very important sites, important events, if we can allow Jerusalem to be significant to Muslims also, maybe that makes things a little bit easier for Muslims to tolerate.
Well, don't sell Jerusalem short with regard to Christians, because Christianity has a lot of claim on.
Yeah, I was going to talk more about Christianity.
Okay.
I'm afraid there's a few more slides here that you can look at online. So I'll say it in a nutshell. There's when Israel was formed, there was a lot of pressure on the Truman administration, especially, to kind of make this happen, because many Christians see Jerusalem as very important for kind of the end of the world sort of thing. There's a movement in Christianity, I call it dispensational premillennialism here. So like the Left Behind books. There's some other, many famous, more or less conservative evangelical kinds of Christians sort of look to the end of the world as kind of beginning in Jerusalem. And what they really want, the way Left Behind works and all of the books and the teaching in that area, the way it works is that things get started off once the Jewish people build a new temple in Jerusalem. So the idea of Jewish people controlling Jerusalem means that they can build another temple, and then the end of the world can kind of get going. But the temple has to be built first. Now, I think that's a little impractical because just about, you're smiling, just about every Jewish person I know is not even slightly interested in trying to build another temple over there, knocking over the Dome of the Rock and building a temple. Most Jewish people, if I may say so,
You're right.
they think about this, they would say, look, when the Messiah comes, the Messiah wants to build a temple, we can build a temple. But until then, we're just not interested. We don't know on which spot the temple mount, which spot of the temple mount you're supposed to build it. You have to build it on the right spot. Nobody knows where that is. Nobody knows, which direction it faces or the architecture. We just don't know. And so it's really kind of a dumb idea. But there's a strong movement in the United States within evangelical Christianity that says that things get really interesting and fun once the Jewish people decide to build a temple. And that can only happen if Jerusalem is part of Israel, right? Because then the Israeli government can, kind of lay plans and get things going and stuff like that. So I just want to say, most Jewish people are not interested in that. I don't think the Israeli government is actually interested. The Israeli government is interested in getting Christians behind Israel. So, and for that reason, sometimes the Israelis sort of play along with the evangelicals because the evangelicals are very happy to push the government to support Israel because of what they see is going to happen. Personally, I think it's more helpful for Christians to say, look, Jewish people need a place to go if things get tough. It's helpful for Christians to say that even in the United States, we can't be 100% sure that the United States is always going to be welcoming to Jews that run into trouble in other countries. We can't always promise that the United States is going to accept Jewish refugees when they face anti-Semitism in France, which is what is happening today. So the idea of Israel as a place of safety is good. The idea of Israel as something where fun end-time events are going to happen, we should, I think, kind of move away from that. But I think as Christians, supporting Israel as a place of safety is a good thing. To make this happen, Muslims have to accept also that some of their land was taken and given to Jewish people. We also have to accept that that's hard for Muslims to agree to. Now, I think most or all of the Muslim countries in the world have more or less agreed that as long as there's a state of Palestine, that they will agree to the idea that Israel should exist and should exist with safe borders. So I think that that's giving a lot. And if we're willing to trade Jerusalem in order to get this place of safety for Israel, I think that's a good Christian response. So we may go over just a little bit if there's other questions. And again, I have a few more slides to talk a little bit more about this very important and still very, very popular Christian idea. Yeah.
I got a real quick question. Who controls? Isn't the Dome of the Rock controlled by another Arab country?
No. It's controlled by Israel, but Israel kind of gives local control to Muslims. I don't think it's controlled by any country. So Israel basically it's Muslims that allow access. So the group of people there from our church, they're allowed to go up to the platform, but they're not allowed in the mosque. When I was in Israel in '97, Christians were allowed to go into the mosque, but they're not allowed.
We can't go on the southern steps, but we couldn't go on the dome in the spring.
Right.
We could sit on the steps.
Okay. to get close to the building. You could go on the mount. That's on the. There's a huge, gigantic platform. It's like half a square mile. It's 5 football fields wide, and it's the place where the temple in Jesus' day was located. And there was a lot of apparatus sort of around that. So so visitors, I think just about anyone can go and walk around up there, but you can't go into the buildings. But so Israel. It's part of Israel. Israel controls it, but they give the local control to the Muslims. It's at these Muslim sites. Any other questions?
I'm just curious what changed when you were able to go there and now Christians can't go in.
There was an issue. It was a few years after I was there, where an Israeli politician wanted to show how tough he was, kind of made a visit and insisted that he was allowed to walk up there, and people got very mad. It might have been so that was one issue where sort of an Israeli politician went there, kind of to show that Israelis were in control, and people got mad at him. And so the Israeli government decided that things would be more harmonious if they let Muslims control it. So I'm not sure. I don't know why the Muslims there have decided not to allow Christians inside the mosque. I had a great time when I was in there, so I hope that changes. Anyone else? Okay. So there was a lot here. If you have questions for me, let me know. But thanks very much. And next week I'm going to be talking more about some things that we as Christians actually can learn from Muslims, and talk about some ways that Christians and Muslims can kind of go forward together. Okay.